think we have a question right here, Julia.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your talk. I have a question about philosophy's relationship to the emergence of new truths. Right? So, because truth, as you say, is a process opened up by the event and so on, but it's a process, right? And then thinking seems to be also a process, right? And, for instance, psychoanalysis is thinking, politics is thinking, but philosophy is, as you say elsewhere, is thinking about thinking, right? So it's also thinking, perhaps qualitatively different. And yet it seems that as a thinking, it should be able to give us truths, right? As maybe again of a different kind as psychoanalysis or politics, and yet it seems like there should be some philosophical truths.
It's a difficult and classical question because to clarify the question of truth, I reduce first. I have reduced first the word truth to the process of production, to some process of production which are not of philosophical nature. It is what you say. In some sense, philosophy is thinking about thinkings, but it's thinking about truth, in fact, because the thinking as political, artistical creation, political action, and so on. And I think that we can speak of thinking of what is truth without saying that thinking about truth, about what is a truth, produces a truth in the same sense than the truth we are speaking of. And it is why I always say that philosophy properly does not create truth. Because if we say that philosophy creates truth, we say something like there exists truth of truths, or truth of truths, because philosophy is always the creation of a concept, the general concept of truth, which authorizes to think concerning truth. And so a thinking is different from a process of production of truth. Naturally, a process of production of truth is a thinking, but all thinking are not process of production of truth. So you have to create a difference between thinking and the strict process of production of a truth, which are reduced, generally speaking, in the form of science, arts, politics, and law. And this opens the possibility to the existence of some disciplines which are thinkings without being truth procedure properly. And so the question of psychoanalysis is the same. Is psychoanalysis something which is more than thinking? Is there really the production of a truth in the field of psychoanalysis? It's a discussion, it's a permanent discussion. For example, there has been an orientation of psychoanalysis in the direction of a science. Freud himself was probably thinking that psychoanalysis was a sort of science. He was a scientist in the sense of the 19th century. But we know today that it's very difficult to affirm that psychoanalysis is a science in the sense of physics. Or there are, I explain precisely in my talk the reason for what it's very difficult to say that psychoanalysis is a science. It's very difficult to say that psychoanalysis is politics. We can do the exercise concerning art and love too. There is something like love in the cure, transfer and so on, transference and so on, transference and so on. So there is something in psychoanalysis which is we go across all types of truth procedure, but which is not reducible to any of them. And it is why, for the moment, I said that psychoanalysis is a thinking, but not a science, not an artistic creation, not a pure existential experience of love, not politics, but psychoanalysis has something in common with philosophy as such, has also something in common with all truth procedure, because philosophy proposes a concept of what is a truth. And the new concept of what is a truth is always in confrontation with all the form of truth procedure. And we return to our beginning. There is a rivalry between the two, because the two are forms of thinking about truth, concerning truth, in relationship to truth, but not being a production of a truth. And I think it's a great difficulty of all this discussion. It's really the confrontations of not different forms of truth, but different forms of thinking. And it's not the same thing. There is a difference. And the question of thinking is a question of the exercise of thought, which has two different forms. First form, the creative one, that is the creation of a new truth in some field. And the second, it's an indirect relationship to truth. Under the supposition of the existence of truth, thinking, a new experience of thought. I know this is a complex and somewhere obscure position, but I think it's very difficult to escape this distinction between the existence of some forms of thinking which are not reducible to the strict production of a new truth, but which are in relationship with the new forms of production of truth.
A couple of questions. One, the question would be whether you could formulate the tension, the shared boundary between philosophy and psychoanalysis, also in terms of the relationship between a tension within Heidegger's own thinking, let's say between early Heidegger and later Heidegger, where in early Heidegger the crucial question is what is Dasein, what is fundamental ontology, and the later questions, which are more, in a way, Dasein in a certain sense drops out, and you have the history of being, and truth processes that, as it were, happen, and Dasein is, is in a certain sense caught up in the truth processes that are immanent to being. The way I would put it that would bring it closer to the problem of psychoanalysis is to link it to the question of anxiety. Because for Heidegger, at least the Heidegger of being in time and around that time, the localization of the void, that is the possibility, the opening of being, transpires, you could say, in mood, in fundamental moods, above all in anxiety. And I'm not sure whether you, what you do with anxiety with respect to ontology. In other words, anxiety with respect to, anxiety clearly belongs to Dasein. Now you might say anxiety is a mode of responsiveness to a void immanent to being. But then then it's a equiprimordiality. It's not that philosophy has in other words, the question is, can you think philosophically without taking into account anxiety? And in a way, the productivity of anxiety for the understanding of being. Because it sounds to me like you want being without the understanding of being. That philosophy doesn't in a way need the kind of being who's in the business of understanding being. And that does sound like later Heidegger. So that's one question. The second question is, I know it's a big question, but I just want the others are less are not questions and more just like asides. When you say Lacan posits a knowledge of the truth of the unknown, why not? I think the tendency is to think of knowledge as scientific knowledge, and I think he's thinking of practical knowledge, know-how, how to work with the way a subject is living with the truth of the unknown, and it's practical engagement, savoir-faire, and not not connaissance, not and I think there's a slip. I think you some of your arguments may lose some of their force if we just think of this knowledge of the truth of the unknown, if we think of that as practical engagement in the space of the clinic. And the last question, which is related to this, the last aside is, aren't you pushing with the math theme, the true transmission, aren't you pushing psychoanalysis back to science? Aren't you pushing psychoanalysis back to science, where you distinguished the mode of transmission of scientific knowledge through repeatability from politics and psychoanalysis, where transmission is always has to be subjective transmission? And aren't you trying to push with the notion of the math theme, trying to in a way push the mode of transmission of psychoanalytic theory and practice back into the arms of science? So the first anxiety. Basically, the first is if you localize the void in being, and not in the subject, then I'm wondering, are you not? At some level, you're saying there's something like being without an understander of being. And there is only an understander of being